The courtroom was a pressure cooker of tension, the kind of atmosphere where even the smallest sound felt like a thunderclap. Devon sat at the defense table, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He tried to appear calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The room was packed with spectators, some who knew him, others who were just there for the spectacle of a high-profile case that had shaken the small city of Austin, Texas. At the back of the room, Devon's family sat in silence. His younger sister, Maya, barely 20, clutched their mother's hand like a lifeline. Maya's eyes were red, tears threatening to spill over, but she held them back. Their mother, on the other hand, wore a mask of quiet strength, her face unreadable. Neither of them spoke. Words felt useless in the heavy charged air of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a man with a confident smirk, shuffled his notes at the front of the room. He carried himself like the verdict was already decided, like Devon's fate was sealed. The court clerk stood nearby, her notepad ready to capture every word that would determine whether Devon walked free or spent the rest of his life behind bars. Then, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Judge Ronald Green entered. The room rose to its feet in unison. Judge Green's reputation was well known. To some, he was a hero, a symbol of justice and order. To others, especially those who stood before him, he was a grim reminder of how quickly the system could strip away everything you held dear. "Be seated," Green said curtly, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. He adjusted his robe and settled into his chair, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room. His gaze lingered on Devon, for a moment before shifting to the documents in front of him. The charges were serious: armed robbery and assault. The prosecution claimed that Devon had walked into a convenience store late one night, brandished a weapon, attacked the clerk, and fled with a handful of cash. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting him. But now, as the cracks in the case began to show, the truth seemed murkier than ever. Devon had always claimed his innocence, but no one had listened. Not until now. The evidence that had once seemed airtight was starting to unravel. The convenience store's security footage was grainy, and the clerk's identification of Devon was shaky at best. Witnesses who had initially supported the prosecution's case were now recanting their statements. Even the weapon used in the robbery had never been found. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room grew thicker. The prosecutor's confident smirk began to waver as the defense presented new evidence that pointed to someone else entirely. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and even Judge Green's stoic expression flickered for a moment. Devon's family held their breath. Maya's grip on her mother's hand tightened. For the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope. The cracks in the case were impossible to ignore, and the truth was finally starting to surface. But the fight was far from over. The prosecution wasn't ready to back down, and Judge Green's reputation for being decisive and unwavering loomed large. As the hearing continued, the question hung in the air. Would justice prevail, or would the system fail Devon once again? He walked to his car, the cool Texas air brushing against his face. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. Devon was tired, but he was used to it. Life had always been a grind, and he had learned to push through the exhaustion. He got into his car, the engine sputtering to life, and began the drive home. But that night, everything changed. As Devon drove through the empty streets, he noticed a convenience store up ahead. The bright neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. He didn't think much of it, just another store he passed every night. But as he got closer, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A figure dressed in dark clothing rushed out of the store, clutching a bag. The figure glanced around nervously before disappearing into the shadows. Devon's instincts kicked in. He pulled over, his mind racing. Should he call the police? Should he follow the figure? Before he could decide, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Within minutes, the store was swarming with police cars, their flashing lights painting. The night in red and blue. Devon stayed in his car, watching as the officers entered the store. He didn't want to get involved, but something told him he couldn't just drive away. He stepped out of his car, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I saw someone run out of the store," he said to the nearest officer. "I think they might have robbed it." The officer looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Stay right there," he said, his voice firm. Devon nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know it then, but that moment would change his life forever. The next thing he knew, he was being handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police car. The officers didn't listen to his protests, didn't care that he was just trying to help. All they saw was a young black man in a grey hoodie, standing near the scene of a crime. To them, that was enough. Now, as Devon stood in the courtroom, he knew he had to make Judge Green see the truth. He had to make him understand that he wasn't the criminal the prosecution had painted him to be. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Your Honor," Devon began, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I didn't rob that store. I didn't hurt anyone. I was just trying to help, but no one listened to me. No one cared about the truth. All they saw was the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing. And now, I'm standing here, facing 50 years of my life being taken away for something I didn't do." The room was silent, the weight of Devon's words hanging in the air. Even the prosecutor seemed to hesitate, his confident smirk faltering. For a moment, Judge Green's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or maybe even regret. Devon took a deep breath, his 5 minutes almost up. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said. "I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm innocent, a chance to show that the system isn't always right. Because if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." As Devon sat back down, the room remained silent. The cracks in the case were impossible to ignore, and the truth was finally starting to surface. But would it be enough to change his fate? Only time would tell. So quickly. The walls of the cell felt like they were closing in, the harsh fluorescent light burning his eyes. Devon sat on the edge of the thin, hard mattress, his mind racing. He replayed the night over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He thought about his family, Maya, his mother, and how they would react when they found out. He thought about his job, his co-workers, and how easily everything he had worked for could be taken away. The next morning, Devon was brought before a judge for his arraignment. The courtroom was smaller than he had imagined, and the air felt heavy with tension. His public defender, a young woman named Sarah, stood by his side. She had been assigned to his case just hours earlier, and though she seemed competent, Devon could tell she was overwhelmed by her caseload. The charges were read aloud: armed robbery and assault. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, painted Devon as a dangerous criminal, a threat to the community. Devon's heart sank as he listened, the words feeling like a death sentence. Sarah did her best to argue for bail, but the judge denied it, citing the seriousness of the charges and Devon's potential flight risk. And just like that, Devon was sent back to his cell, his future hanging in the balance. But that didn't change the fact that the jury had spoken. Judge Green had always believed in the system, in its ability to deliver justice. But as he looked up from the file and saw Devon sitting at the defense table, something felt off. The young man's posture was tense, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation that Green had seen too many times before. Yet there was something different about Devon, something that made Green pause. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The prosecutor stood, ready to argue for the maximum sentence, his voice dripping with confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendant has been found guilty of armed robbery and assault. These are serious crimes that have left a lasting impact on the victim and the community. We urge the court to impose the maximum sentence of 50 years, sending a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated." Devon's public defender, Sarah, rose to her feet, her expression weary but determined. "Your Honor," she said, "while we respect the jury's decision, we ask the court to consider the lack of concrete evidence in this case. My client has no prior record, and there are inconsistencies in the eyewitness testimony. We believe a lesser sentence would be more appropriate." Judge Green listened, his face unreadable. He had heard these arguments countless times before, but something about this case nagged at him. The grainy surveillance footage, the vague description of the suspect, the fact that Devon had an alibi, none of it added up to the kind of certainty Green preferred when handing down a sentence. "Mr. Carter," Judge Green said, his voice cutting through the silence, "is there anything you'd like to say before I proceed with sentencing?" Devon stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with Judge Green's. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I didn't do this. I was at work that night, surrounded by people who can vouch for me. I've never been in trouble before, and I've spent my life trying to do the right thing. But none of that mattered when the police saw me. All they saw was a black man in a hoodie, and that was enough for them to decide I was guilty." The room seemed to hold its breath as Devon continued. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just asking for a fair chance. I'm asking you to look at the facts, not the assumptions. Because if you do, you'll see that the truth is right there. I'm innocent, Your Honor, and I'm begging you not to let the system take my life away." For a moment, the courtroom was completely still. Even the prosecutor seemed to hesitate, his confident demeanor faltering. Judge Green leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being fair, on following the law without bias. But as he looked at Devon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. "I'll take your statement under advisement," Judge Green said finally, his tone measured. "Sentencing will be postponed until next week. In the meantime, I'll review the evidence and the arguments presented. Court is adjourned." As the gavel came down, Devon felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing, but hope nonetheless. He didn't know if it would be enough, but for the first time in months, he felt like someone had actually listened, but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. "I stand before you today, not just as a defendant, but as a man who has been failed by the very system that's supposed to protect him. I didn't commit this crime. I was at work that night, surrounded by people who can vouch for me. But none of that mattered when the police saw me. All they saw was a black man in a hoodie, and that was enough for them to decide I was guilty." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Devon. Even the prosecutor, who had been so confident moments earlier, seemed to hesitate. Devon continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've spent my life trying to do the right thing. I work long hours to support my family. I've never been in trouble before. But none of that mattered when the jury heard the prosecution's case. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a stereotype, a threat. And now I'm facing 50 years of my life being taken away for something I didn't do." Devon paused, his chest rising and falling as he fought to keep his composure. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for justice. I'm asking you to look at the facts, not the assumptions. Look at the grainy footage, the shaky eyewitness testimony, the lack of concrete evidence. Look at the alibi I've provided, the people who can confirm I was at work that night. Look at the truth, and you'll see that I'm innocent." Judge Green listened intently, his expression unreadable, but his mind racing. He had heard countless defendants plead their cases before, but there was something about Devon's words that struck a chord. The young man's defiance wasn't born of anger or desperation. It was born of a deep, unshakable belief in the truth. And for the first time in his career, Green found himself questioning the system he had spent decades upholding. The prosecutor stood, ready to counter Devon's statement, but Green raised a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "I've heard enough," the judge said, his voice firm but not unkind. Sentencing will be postponed until next week. In the meantime, I'll review the evidence and the arguments presented. Court is adjourned. As the gavel came down, Devon felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing, but hope nonetheless. He didn't know if it would be enough, but for the first time in months, he felt like someone had actually listened. That I was at work that night, but the court denied the request. My co-workers were willing to vouch for me, but their statements were dismissed as irrelevant. The surveillance footage from the store is grainy, and the description of the suspect is vague, so vague that it could apply to hundreds of people. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was that I fit the description. A tall black man in a hoodie. Devon's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through, his determination unwavering. Your Honor, I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who's been failed by this system. For everyone who's been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. I'm asking you to look beyond the assumptions and see the truth. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove my innocence. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Devon's words hanging in the air. Even the prosecutor, who had been so confident, moments earlier, seemed to hesitate. Judge Green leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He had heard countless defendants plead their cases before, but there was something about Devon's words that struck a chord. The young man's defiance wasn't born of anger or desperation. It was born of a deep, unshakable belief in the truth. After a long moment, Judge Green spoke, his voice measured but firm. Mr. Carter, I've heard your statement and I'll take it under advisement. Sentencing will be postponed until next week. In the meantime, I'll review the evidence and the arguments presented. Court is adjourned. As the gavel came down, Devon felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing, but hope nonetheless. He didn't know if it would be enough, but for the first time in months he felt like someone had actually listened, but carrying a hint of urgency. Your Honor, we respectfully request a continuance to gather and present the evidence my client has referenced. This includes the surveillance footage from his workplace, testimony from his supervisor and co-workers, and a formal statement from the eyewitness who has since recanted her identification. We believe this evidence will prove Mr. Carter's innocence beyond any doubt. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a last-ditch effort to delay sentencing. The jury has already rendered its verdict, and the evidence presented during the trial was sufficient to convict. Granting a continuance now would set a dangerous precedent. Judge Green raised a hand, silencing both attorneys. His gaze shifted between Devon and the prosecutor, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, every breath held as the judge considered his next words. Mr. Carter, Judge Green began, his tone measured, you've made serious allegations about the handling of your case. If what you say is true, it raises significant concerns about the fairness of your trial. However, the court cannot act on claims alone. Evidence must be presented, and due process must be followed. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward. I will grant a 2-week continuance to allow the defense to gather and present the evidence they've referenced. If this evidence is as compelling as you claim, it will be considered in a new hearing. If not, sentencing will proceed as scheduled. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Devon's family exhaled in unison, their relief palpable. Devon himself felt a surge of hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. 2 weeks wasn't much time, but it was a chance to prove his innocence, to expose the cracks in the case, and to hold the system accountable. As the bailiffs led Devon out of the courtroom, he glanced back at his family. Maya gave him a small, encouraging smile, her eyes glistening with tears. His mother nodded, her expression a mix of pride and determination. They believed in him, and for the first time in months, Devon allowed himself to believe too. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice trembling but clear. No, I'm not certain. It all happened so fast, and I was scared. When the police showed me his photo, they made it seem like they already knew he was the one. I didn't want to let them down. But now, after everything, I don't think it was him. I don't think I ever really knew. The courtroom erupted into whispers, the weight of Teresa's confession settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Devon's lawyer seized the moment, her voice steady but urgent. Your Honor, this is exactly why we've been fighting to present this evidence. The eyewitness identification, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, is unreliable. Combined with the denied motions for employment records, GPS data, and surveillance footage, it's clear that my client was not given a fair trial. The prosecutor, visibly flustered, shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The witness's testimony was credible at the time of the trial. The defense is now trying to exploit her doubts to undermine a verdict that was reached based on the evidence presented. Judge Green raised a hand, silencing the room. His expression was stern, but there was a flicker of something deeper. Doubt, perhaps, or even regret. Miss Grayson, he said, his voice calm but firm. Are you willing to sign an affidavit stating what you've just told this court? Teresa nodded, her hands still trembling. Yes, Your Honor. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. The judge leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping against the desk as he processed the revelation. The tension in the room was thick, every eye fixed on him as he weighed his next words. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. This court cannot ignore the serious concerns that have been raised today. The integrity of the trial has been called into question, and it is this court's duty to ensure that justice is served, not just for the defendant, but for the system as a whole. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. I am granting a new hearing to review the evidence that was previously denied. This includes the surveillance footage from Mr. Carter's workplace, testimony from his supervisor and co-workers, and any other relevant evidence the defense wishes to present. Sentencing is postponed indefinitely until this matter is resolved. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Devon's family embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. Devon himself felt a surge of relief, though he knew the fight was far from over. This was a chance to prove his innocence, to expose the flaws in the system, and to reclaim his life. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom, Devon glanced back at his family. Maya gave him a small, encouraging smile, her eyes glistening with tears. His mother nodded, her expression a mix of pride and determination. They believed in him, and for the first time in months, Devon allowed himself to believe too, but carrying the weight of authority. This court will not stand by while the truth is buried under procedural technicalities. Justice demands transparency, and it is this court's duty to ensure that every piece of evidence is thoroughly examined. If there is even the slightest chance that an innocent man has been wrongfully convicted, we must act. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Court is adjourned for today. We will reconvene in 48 hours to review the new evidence. Until then, Mr. Carter will remain in custody, but I will consider a motion for bail if the defense wishes. To file one, the gavel came down with a sharp crack and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, spectators whispered furiously, and Devon's family clung to each other, their emotions raw and overwhelming. Devon himself sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but hope nonetheless. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom, Devon glanced back at his family. Maya gave him a small, encouraging smile, her eyes glistening with tears. His mother nodded, her expression a mix of pride and determination. They believed in him, and for the first time in months, Devon allowed himself to believe too. The days in the cell felt like an eternity, each one stretching longer than the last. Devon spent his time replaying the courtroom scene in his mind, clinging to the memory of Judge Green's words and the flicker of hope they had ignited. He thought about his family, Maya's tearful smile, his mother's quiet strength, and how they had stood by him through it all, their unwavering support, was the only thing keeping him grounded as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the case was gaining momentum. The subpoenaed evidence, surveillance footage from Devon's workplace, GPS data from his phone, and sworn affidavits from his supervisor and co-workers painted a clear picture of his alibi. The footage showed Devon clocking out at 12:07 a.m., just as he had claimed, and his GPS data confirmed his route home, far from the convenience store where the robbery had taken place. The defense team also uncovered discrepancies in the police report, including the fact that the arresting officers had failed to follow up on leads that could have exonerated Devon from the start. The officers involved in Devon's arrest were called to testify, their discomfort palpable as they faced tough questioning from Devon's lawyer. Under oath, they admitted to cutting corners in their investigation, relying on the eyewitness identification and Devon's appearance, a tall black man in a hoodie, as enough to make an arrest. Their testimony revealed a pattern of rushed decisions and implicit bias, casting a harsh light on the flaws in the system. When the hearing reconvened, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and curious spectators filled the gallery, all eager to see how the case would unfold. Devon sat at the defense table, his heart pounding as Judge Green entered the room. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Green wasted no time. "This court has reviewed the new evidence and heard testimony from all relevant parties," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "It is clear that there were significant oversights in the investigation and trial of Mr. Carter. The evidence presented today leaves no doubt that Mr. Carter was not at the scene of the crime and that his arrest was based on flawed assumptions rather than concrete facts." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "In light of this, I am overturning Mr. Carter's conviction and ordering his immediate release. Furthermore, I am recommending a full review of the procedures followed in this case to ensure that such an injustice does not occur again." The courtroom erupted. Devon's family burst into tears, hugging each other tightly as the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifted. Devon himself sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling as the bailiffs removed his cuffs. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. As he walked out of the courtroom, a free man, Devon was met with a crowd of supporters, friends, family, and strangers who had followed his case and rallied behind him. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Devon's focus was on his family. Maya rushed forward, throwing her arms around him, and his mother followed, her face wet with tears. "We knew you'd come home," Maya whispered, her voice breaking. Devon hugged them tightly, his own tears falling freely. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Devon knew there would be challenges, rebuilding his life, fighting for accountability, and healing from the trauma of his wrongful conviction. But for now, he allowed himself to bask in the moment, in the knowledge that the truth had finally set him free, he said, his voice carrying a rare warmth. "You are free to go. This court apologizes for the injustice you have endured. I hope you can find peace and rebuild your life." The courtroom erupted again, this time with a mix of applause, tears, and shouts of relief. Devon stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. His lawyer, Miss Ellis, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her own eyes glistening with emotion. "You did it," she whispered. "You fought for the truth." And it won. Devon turned to his family, who were already rushing toward him. Maya reached him first, throwing her arms around him in a tight embrace. "I knew you'd come home," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Their mother followed, her hands cupping his face as she looked into his eyes. "My boy," she said, her voice breaking. "My brave, strong boy." For the first time in months, Devon allowed himself to truly breathe. The weight of the wrongful conviction, the fear of losing decades of his life, the anger at a system that had failed him. It all began to lift. But amidst the relief, there was also a fire burning within him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been wronged by the same system, the ones who didn't have the support or resources to fight back. As Devon walked out of the courtroom, he was met with a crowd of supporters, activists, reporters, and strangers who had followed his case. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in his direction, but Devon's focus was on the people who had stood by him. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "This isn't just my victory," he said. "This is for everyone who's been failed by the system, for everyone who's been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. We have to keep fighting. We have to demand change, because no one should have to go through what I went through." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the courthouse halls. Devon's words resonated far beyond that moment, sparking conversations about racial bias, wrongful convictions, and the urgent need for criminal justice reform. In the weeks that followed, Devon became a symbol of hope and resilience. He worked with advocacy groups to share his story, pushing for policy changes that would prevent others from suffering the same fate. His case became a rallying cry, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. But amidst the activism and the public appearances, Devon also took time to heal. He spent quiet moments with his family, rebuilding the life that had been taken from him. He returned to work, grateful for the support of his co-workers and supervisor who had stood by him from the beginning. And as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling of his own home, Devon allowed himself to dream again, to imagine a future where the system was fair, where no one had to fear being wrongfully convicted because of the color of their skin. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Devon felt like he was walking it with purpose. Devon's story didn't end with his freedom. It was just the beginning. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight hitting his face for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew his life had changed in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. The cameras, the reporters, the flashing lights, it was overwhelming. But Devon kept his focus on his family. Maya clung to his arm, her tears of joy mixing with laughter, while his mother held his hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. The media frenzy around his case turned Devon into a symbol, a face for the countless others who had been wrongfully convicted, their stories buried under the weight of a flawed system. Advocacy groups reached out, inviting him to speak at rallies, conferences, and town halls. At first, Devon hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker. He was just a man who had fought for his freedom. But then he thought about the others, the ones still sitting in cells, their voices silenced by the same system that had failed him. He couldn't stay silent. His first speech was at a local community centre, packed with activists, lawyers, and families of incarcerated individuals. Devon stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out at the sea of faces. "I'm not here because I'm special," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "I'm here because I got lucky. I had people who believed in me, who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. But what about the ones who don't have that? What about the ones who are still waiting for someone to listen?" The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. Devon continued, his words pouring out with a raw honesty that resonated deeply. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. It's about making sure that no one has to go through what I went through. And if my story can help even one person, then it was worth it." His speech sparked a wave of support, and soon Devon found himself at the forefront of a growing movement for criminal justice reform. He worked with lawmakers to push for changes in how eyewitness testimony was handled, advocating for stricter guidelines to prevent misidentifications. He also fought for better access to evidence for defendants, ensuring that no one would be denied the chance to prove their innocence. But amidst the activism and the public appearances, Devon never forgot where he came from. He returned to his job at the warehouse, grateful for the support of his co-workers and supervisor, who had stood by him from the beginning. He spent quiet evenings with his family, rebuilding the life that had been taken from him. And every night before he went to sleep, he reminded himself of the promise he had made to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been failed by the system. Devon's journey became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth could prevail. His story inspired documentaries, articles, and even a book, all of which shed light on the systemic issues that had led to his wrongful conviction. But more importantly, it inspired people to take action, to demand accountability, to push for change, and to never stop fighting for justice. As Devon stood on the steps of the courthouse 1 year after his release, surrounded by supporters and activists, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still long, and the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "This isn't just my story," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is our story, and together we can make sure it has a happy ending."